about later on in the presentation today. And a lot of this, due to historical misuses of participants in research. Many of you may be aware of the Tuskegee syphilis study that was done in the 1960s and early 70s. Certainly the Nazi trials, things of that nature, where participants were basically being used for the benefit of the researchers, regardless of any type of respect for the people that were involved. And because of that, it was determined that there needed to be a little bit more oversight over what was occurring to make sure that people that were involved in research were protected to a certain extent. And the result of that is what is known in the IRB world as the Belmont Report, which was created in 1979. And this report serves to identify the ethical principles that should be considered with research that involves human subjects. And these are the three major principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And each of those plays a different part, and it is the interplay of these aspects as well that we consider when we are reviewing research, both for students and faculty. Specific to respect for persons, this is most keenly seen as helping understand that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents who are capable of making their own decisions about whether or not to participate. But additionally, providing additional support or just recognizing when there may be participants that may have diminished autonomy. And specific to our topic today, definitely students, especially students that are in the K-12 situation, educational systems that have not reached the age of consent and are by all means considered minors within the U.S. at the very least. There are different aspects that we need to consider when a study involves those populations. And certainly a major part of research is the consent process and making sure that we provide enough information to individuals so that they can make an informed decision about whether or not participating in the study would be in their best interest. And again, specific to student populations is recognizing if the need to involve the parent, especially for those students that are under 18, are involved, so that way we can be sure that again we have those additional protections. The second principle, beneficence, is essentially the old adage of do no harm. Don't conduct a study that puts participants at risks. And certainly you want to ensure that the benefits of the study are maximized. And the largest play in this too, especially with our topic today, is minimizing that perception of coercion. And I really do want to highlight the word perception because it's not uncommon for researchers to feel like because whatever measures they've taken, the coercion is just gone. And in all likelihood, it very well could be. But it is the perception of the potential participant that we also need to keep in mind. And so even though a researcher might have taken certain steps, if that researcher is still seen as somebody of an authority figure or somebody that could impact a student's grades or impact somebody's employability, those are issues that we need to take into consideration and within the context of what the researcher's role and relationship to those potential participants is. And finally, the last uh, principle is justice. And essentially, what that comes down to is ensuring that those that participate in research will somehow benefit from it. And certainly not, this is more keenly made aware as far as not using individuals just because they are a captive or a convenient population. And this is something that is very prominent, especially with educational research, because especially studies that maybe focus on something that's impacting kids. there's a high concentration of kids in educational settings. They're very easy to access, especially if a researcher works in an educational setting. But the use of a classroom or use of a school setting is not always appropriate if the topic isn't really within the educational realm. And so we do need to make sure that we've considered whether the educational place, whether it be a elementary or high school or even a college setting, is appropriate based on what the topic is. And then essentially the how these three come into play together is the kind of the overarching is the risk benefit analysis. What it comes down to is the benefits of a study need to outweigh the risks. And really, in any study involving human participants, there is going to be some level of risk. A lot of the time, especially with social behavioral research, those risks are fairly minimal compared to what those participants would experience in real life. But we just need to make sure that our researchers have identified and been made aware of what those risks are so that they can be acknowledged, minimized to the best extent possible, so that way the ultimate benefits of these studies will shine through and help the student researchers move forward with their research. So do you want to go to the next slide, Lori? So at this time, we would just ask that you answer some information, and I'll hand it over to Lori as far as what the steps are for answering the poll.
Well, that's a great question, Jenny, and there's our first snag today, so I apologize for that. The poll question is, first of all, at what level are your students intending to conduct research? And I don't have the poll set up, so here's what we're going to do. Just in the chat area, if you would just type in whether you have students intending to conduct research in preschool, in K-12, college, university, or perhaps you don't have students right now conducting research. So if you just type in, that will give us kind of an idea of what settings you'll be you'll be working in. So I'll give you just a few seconds to do that, and then we'll move on to the second poll question. Thank you. You know, it looks like we have a real variety of interests here. We have K-12, we have lots of high school, we have lots of college, university, we have some folks in other settings. So that's really great. Gives us some broad perspectives. So please bring in those perspectives and ask those questions as we move forward, because I think while there and I'm kind of in on Jenny's territory here, while there are some general things to think about in an educational setting, some of them are specific to the level you're working at. So the next question is, what positions do your students hold? So if you have students, in other words, who are doing research, or if you're doing research, is the researcher a teacher in the school? Are they a school staff administrator? Are they a district administrator? Or do they hold some other kind of position? If that's the case, go ahead and type that in, and we'll take a look and see what our answers are to that. I'll give you just a few seconds to do that.
Oh, no.
Looks like a little bit of everything here as well. Teachers, a lot of teachers. We have some administrators, some district administrators. I just saw some college faculty. Phil, you've got lots of administrators and a single teacher. So, yeah, again, lots of diversity and a real good spread. Jenny, anything else you want to say about that before we move to the next slide? I think that gives us some real good context for the rest of our conversation.
No, I agree, and again, the purpose was just to make sure to see, if everybody was part of K-12 schools, we'd certainly kind of focus more on that. But since we do have quite a bit of diversity, I just, that way we can make sure that we hit on some topics that hit the wide range that is educational research. So yes, please feel free to move to the next slide. Okay, and really, we often get a question from students that ask if they can conduct the studies in the schools where they are employed. And especially for students in the EDD program specifically, they are really encouraged to conduct studies. The purpose is to address a local problem. And there's certainly many, many advantages to doing this. They are very familiar with the problem. They've experienced it firsthand. They understand the implications of what's going wrong, or they are maybe the first to identify that there is a problem and are finally in a place to try to do something about that. Additionally, they're familiar with the participants. They're familiar with people who would be able to provide uh, usable data and really informative points about the topic and to try to figure out what it would take to address the problem. And in addition to, knowing the problem, knowing the participants, they're aware of the environment, of the culture. As insiders at the school, they know who to contact, what the processes are to, even obtain approval to conduct research. They may be in better positions to be approved to conduct research. So there certainly are many, many advantages to conducting research, and there are a lot of opportunities for students to conduct studies at the schools where they are employed. But Laura, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. The same reasons why conducting a study in one's own school can often be many of the reasons that could potentially increase the risk to doing so. For example, being aware, being friendly, knowing who the potential participants are, having a working relationship, or even teachers in the school could easily result in biases towards selecting participants and or possibly collecting data that could potentially reflect favorably on the school or the researcher, possibly the researcher's colleagues. And sometimes it can be used as a platform for some people to really try to promote their own viewpoints or their own predetermined opinions rather than focusing on what the topic and what the research is. And because of that familiarity, it can be rather difficult to help keep people on the right track and to really get unbiased opinions and unbiased information. At the same time, um, because of that familiarity and uh, collegial relationship that many of our student researchers have with the potential participants, the risk for a potential breach of confidentiality can also be a bit higher as well, because in all honesty, it can be very difficult to keep track of what colleagues may have said in various circumstances. This is really very acutely seen in cities where maybe teachers are being asked about their opinions about various school policies or programs that have been implemented. And not all policies are received favorably, not all programs are received favorably. And if teachers are wanting to give their honest opinions in a research setting, that is certainly a great avenue for them to do that and to explore, whether something is working or not. But at the same time, if somebody discloses something in a research setting, and you and a researcher would kind of forget, well, did a person say that in this interview that I held with this person, or did they say it in a faculty meeting or in this private conversation? It can get tricky to keep track of all of that and to keep to make sure that what is said in private maintains that privacy. And so it can be a little tricky for them to keep that separation, just because they do know everybody so well. And at the same time, again, that familiarity of knowing their colleagues, knowing the potential participants, that can also actually work against them because, Walden is committed to the basic principle that research participants should volunteer with a motive to help generate new knowledge, not just to help out a friend. And it goes the same way, as far as people that teachers or principals, again, not using those relationships to leverage others into potentially participating. And it's not uncommon for researchers to have difficulty in separating out, what those different roles are, and going back to, that the original side of those ethical principles of, that respect for persons, of, really keeping track of what the potential participants' perceptions are. Even if, if it's a teacher, even if they're very well known or very well liked, if they're asking students to participate, despite how well known and how well liked they are still an authority in the school, and so it can be difficult for some students or even parents to say no or to give honest answers. And so those are just some things that researchers need to keep in mind. And then again, with the potential for perceived coercion and the potential of actual coercion, depending on the student researcher's role in the school, we really do need to take a look at the professional role of the student relative to how they intend to collect the data. Certainly, the researchers that are in positions of authority, there might be some limitations on how they can actually collect the data, and we'll go into that a little bit more. But certainly, it's placing the research within the context of the situation and what might be acceptable given a certain position. There might be some different nuances and some different issues that need to be considered for somebody that's in a different circumstance. Um, Lauren, do you want to go to the next slide? Okay, so just to kind of get some hurdles out of the way, we kind of refer to these as non-negotiable areas that students need to consider. And certainly we really want to encourage students in the research that they're doing, encourage the topics that they're pursuing, but also just want to highlight that for certain topics, for um, certain areas of research, there are certain things that the Walden IRB, we just simply can't oversee, and there are workarounds. There are certainly other options available, but students, it is important for them to be aware of these things so that they can prepare for that while they're working on their proposal rather than right at the IRB stage. And so the first major issue is often students want to know if one curriculum is better than another, or if implementing a certain intervention will positively impact their achievement or their behavior in school, or anything of that nature. However, the Walden IRB cannot oversee curriculum or intervention implementation. Those are elements that would need to be overseen and implemented by the school according to their policies and procedures. Now, this certainly doesn't mean that students can't study this. Absolutely and totally, they can study and focus their research around these programs or interventions. They just need to separate, which can be very, very difficult for students, the curriculum or that intervention, which would be overseen by the school, from the research, which would be learning about that intervention or that curriculum. And so there certainly are various options with that, and we'll go into that a little bit later in the presentation. But just wanted to really let your students know that if that's what the focus of their study is, to really become aware of some of the materials that we have so that they can help prepare their research accordingly. Along with that, we do often have some requests of research where students are trying to randomize students into interventions or curriculum modifications, and that kind of goes in with the comments that I made before, where it is understandable why students want to do that, because certainly that's kind of the gold standard of research is having that randomized experimental study. But that randomization into an intervention or a curriculum is also not something that the Walden IRB can oversee. Um, for one thing, it would not be ethical to withhold what would be considered to be standard instruction or educational opportunities that could benefit students should they or their parents not want to participate in a research or study. Students should not have to participate just to get opportunities to enhance their education. And so, if there is if a student is looking at, whether one intervention or another is better, or one curriculum is better than another, it ultimately would be up to the school to determine which students receive the intervention or the curriculum. And that would be, again, something that's separate from the research. And we know students definitely struggle with finding where that separation needs to be made. And so certainly want to encourage again, that if you have students that are looking at this, to have them contact the IRB so that we can help early on, help them identify some potential solutions and some potential opportunities for how they can practically conduct their research because we've had a lot of students come through doing studies that involve, studying about the effects of a certain intervention or curriculum or to see how things are working or what impact they may have made. So there's definitely a lot of potential. It's just, like I said, it's that separation that we need to help them understand where that is so that they can practically conduct their research. And with that too is I certainly would want to highlight it's really not uncommon for students to bring what they're learning here at Walden back to their home institutions, back to their schools, which is what we expect, and that it's very exciting when we can see students doing that. And it's the with when it comes to interventions or curriculum modification, even if it is the student wanting to do that, again, the idea to modify an instruction or to implement an intervention doesn't necessarily need to be initiated by the school. A student can certainly raise an idea of something that can be done, even if it's an idea that was learned at Walden. But the student would just need to work with the school to find out how such a project could be implemented under their own oversight. And those again are sometimes where we just need to make sure that our student researchers are clear with the schools where they're conducting their studies to make sure that the schools understand what it is that they're overseeing, because we certainly don't want to give the impression that Walden is overseeing something when actually we need the school to do that instead. And again, it it's very exciting when we can have the schools that can benefit from what the students are learning here at Walden. And we've seen a lot of great studies where schools have been willing to take what the student is learning and apply it and then give that student that additional opportunity. So again, there are a lot of opportunities for students with this. And again, just because of the role that some of our students have in the schools, whether they be teachers or administrators, there are some additional really practical details that need to be considered. In general, somebody who's in a position of authority, such as a teacher or maybe a principal, they really cannot collect identifiable data from their subordinates or students that they're currently teaching. So for example, if a teacher is wanting to understand what students think about a certain way that math is being taught, asking students they're currently teaching really would not be in the best interest of the student, because it would be very difficult for them to say no without feeling that they've somehow let their instructor or their teacher down. And the same thing goes for, principals asking their teachers in their school to, do a focus group to find out what they think about a new program that the principal implemented. It puts a strain on that relationship that can easily be avoided with some different with some creative options sometimes. And the issue, I would just add one other point too. When we're considering a position of authority, um, clearly when there's a direct relationship, such as a principal to a teacher, or maybe a college dean to a college instructor, where it's very clear what that relationship is, it's very easy to see the potential for perceived coercion. But also, sometimes there is an indirect line. If you're looking at maybe a superintendent wanting to collect identifiable data from teachers, depending on the situation and depending on, maybe the size of the district, there are other elements at play that need to be considered because in reality, the superintendent is still over a teacher. And it can be difficult to say no to somebody who could ultimately have the authority to impact maybe where a teacher teaches next year. And it's not to say that any of our students would do that, would retaliate against somebody for not participating. But at the same time, it is the perception that could be out there that there could be a teacher who feels that they have to participate because they're fearful of what would happen if they didn't. And on the flip side too of, if you're providing data to somebody that is considered your superior, it can be very difficult to give truly honest answers when they know what you're saying. If you don't really agree with the program that was implemented, or if you feel that a way of teaching isn't really the best method, and that goes against the researchers' opinions, it can be difficult to share those honest opinions for fear that it could impact their ability to retain their job or to keep the position that they have. And again, it's not to say that our researchers would do that, but it is just something we need to keep in mind that it's the participants' mindset that we need to be coming from and to understand that it is possible that they could think those things as well. Um, The last point too that I would like to highlight with this is when it comes to collecting data in educational settings, the timing of the data collection really is important as well. When it comes to a lot of times, when you're collecting data in a school, it's very easy to just do it while the students are in school as well, but we don't want students to miss class time and to miss instruction just to complete a survey or to be interviewed, which would then force them to have to make up that work at a later time. So it really, if data is collected within a school period, we really want to make sure that any disruptions like that are minimized. And then additionally, kind of another layer on top of that is considering whether the school is even the best place to collect the actual data. It might be a very appropriate place to do recruitment, but if it's a very sensitive topic, collecting the data, it might be better to do that someplace else. For example, studies that are looking at experiences with bullying. If it is at a middle school, if the bullier or if the bully sees the student participant going in to have an interview with the researcher, that bully could feel that it's possible that the person that they've been bullying is going to rat them out. And that could cause some problems for that participant at that point. And so just some little things like that to really consider, to make sure that sufficient privacy is in place, to make sure that those participants are protected, even if the topic and everything else is in place and appropriate for that educational setting. It's just making sure that steps are in place to not place any additional risk, to maximize the protection of those participants. Do you want to go to the next slide, Lori?
You bet. And while I'm doing that, I just want to remind folks, if you're on the phone, could you please just mute your phone? We're hearing just a little bit of background noise. If you're on voice over IP, I have you muted, but if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat area for Leilani, or raise your hand and we'll call on you. Thanks.
And now we're to the what I consider to be the fun point of our presentation. And the fun part of what we get to do in the IRB is really helping students identify practical solutions because we do see so much great research, so many great possibilities. There really are a lot of available options out there for students. And one of the things that I really would stress is helping students keep an open mind about what it takes with regards to collecting the data for their studies because it's not uncommon for them to feel like there's one way to do it. And while that passion is certainly appreciated, putting it into the context of what can be practically accomplished is a bit more tricky. And so certainly helping them identify, some alternatives is really always going to be in their best interest. Um, One idea to consider, and I'd like to actually invite Leilani to speak about this, is to really have students consider whether or not there is possibly any data that the school might have that they could use to conduct what we would refer to as a secondary analysis, because the data is generated for something that the school does, but then the student does a secondary analysis on that data for their research purposes. And so I would like to invite Leilani to provide some more information about that, um, specific to the educational settings.
Thanks, Jenny. We're making a really quite an effort this year in the Center for Research Quality to help all of our researchers, both students and faculty, to be aware of all the research opportunities using secondary analysis of different types of data. And Jenny referred to one type of data, which is, and there are several that are eligible for secondary analysis. Jenny mentioned there might be data that the school already has. That's, we often refer to that as retrospective data because it's already in existence. As we all know, schools keep records on lots of different things. They actually, there's grades and all kinds of assessments. There's also student records, personnel records, and student work products of many types. And I really, I feel that what I've observed in meeting with students at residencies and talking with them, doing this brainstorming, practical problem solving over the phone with them and over email, what I've observed is that students often overlook lots of opportunities in their midst. If you go into work in any day and just think to yourself, because a lot of our student researchers are doing research in the context in which they work, especially those in the EDD program, if they were to go into work with the outlook of, well, there's data all around me if I just look around, they would see, a dozen different doctoral study or dissertation opportunities. And we're trying to help our students think in that mode, and which really ties into the essence of what being a scholar practitioner is. It's sort of an idea that you don't have to do the old-fashioned, sit down and interview people or sit down and survey people in order to do inquiry, in order to analyze evidence from your surroundings. There's so many ways to conduct meaningful analyses that do not involve a consent form, that do not involve an interview or in a survey. And, nothing against those traditional methods, but we really feel that given the scholar practitioner model that Walden espouses, as well as the social change mission, that we really could be doing more to help engage students in their environments, in their work settings, in a way that they are going to be answering questions that have a great deal of meaning, that are very tied to practice is what I'm getting at. So just to give a really quick overview, and I'm going to touch on them now, and I want you to know that at the summer faculty meeting in National Harbor, the Center for Research Quality, CRQ, is going to be doing a session to just an hour on this topic of secondary analysis. And then we'll also be offering to come out and join various faculty groups and talk more about this. So Jenny had mentioned that there's sometimes this data that already exists at the school, and it's maybe housed by the central office or maybe by individual teachers. Maybe they have, going back over the years, copies of student work products that could be analyzed. There's also future-looking data. Sometimes we call it perspective prospective, as in yet to come, data, and that's really an interesting opportunity because our students in their research role, or I should say our students in their professional roles, have opportunities to impact what data is generated and what activities occur at the school in the future. So I feel that actually sometimes faculty steer students away from this, but it is fine. For example, for a researcher, one of our students who happens to be a school counselor, for example. Let's say they're going to be implementing a anti-bullying program or a character education type of program. And as part of that program, they're going to be doing journaling. Actually, let's just say for a moment they know from the outset that the school really wants to know what is the impact of this program. Then it would be perfectly fine to make journaling a part of this character education program so that the primary purpose is that it gives students an opportunity to reflect on their experience in the character education program. So it's the primary purpose, but a secondary purpose would be that it's analyzed by a researcher. And so we're trying to help get examples like that out there. That was just one. We've got dozens to share. So I'll be reaching out soon in the future to maybe talk to you. And I'm not sure how we're going to get this out to students, but I feel like getting this out to faculty is step one because there's nothing wrong with old-fashioned surveys and interviews, but there's so many other opportunities for doing research with secondary analyses. And many times when students are a bit frustrated because let's say they're the principal and they had really sort of had their heart set on doing interviews at their school. And I understand why they would want to. But here IRB or their committee is telling them, no, that's not going to really work. You're basically the the boss of the school. Your authority level is not going to be all right to just invite people to opt into this interview that serves as your dissertation. And then they get frustrated, and what can I do? Well, there are lots of different types of data being generated every day as part of your school's regular operations. What parts of those, what data points could help give you the evidence you need to answer your research questions. So that's the type of troubleshooting we want to do, and I would say please stay tuned for more on various types of secondary analysis because we are finding that secondary analysis is often a solution for students. And just to mention that student who's a principal, because this impacts so many of our students, especially in the leadership program, another popular solution is to do anonymous data collection because if you make the data collection completely anonymous, and by that I mean the researcher, this principal, has no idea who volunteered and who didn't, so obviously interviews won't work, but you could do surveying. The fact that the principal doesn't know who volunteered, who didn't, that helps neutralize sort of the coercion dynamic. And frankly, it probably helps people feel more honest and open, giving their genuine responses about the issue, whatever it is, if it's anonymous. And that's another popular solution. And as Jenny mentioned, sometimes the solution for someone who's in an authority position is just to go to a different site where they're not an authority figure and they're introduced to this community as, well, this is a researcher, and you're invited to opt into the study or you decline. These are some of the different types of brainstorming options that we want to have the opportunity to review with your students. And so I'm going to make a plug real quick for the IRB office hours. I'm putting a link here. Oops, didn't work. I'm going to have to. I'm going to put there we go. I'm putting in a link that lists the office hours for the IRB because we have staff members available. Right now it's 3 different hours every week, and students can come join and just brainstorm these types of solutions. Or even if they're very early on and they don't even quite know what the issues are yet, they can listen and ask questions as they pop into their heads because these faculty members are there, these IRB members are there in order to just broadly explore IRB solutions and just ethical issues with students.
Thanks, Leilani.
Great. Thank you so much, Leilani.
Thanks, Leilani. We had a couple of questions in the chat box. The first one was from Peter. He asked, several of my students wish to utilize single participant designs. What general IRB requirements would they have to fulfill to advance such a study?
You know, is it okay if I type a response in there? I'd like to make sure Jenny gets a chance to move through the whole presentation, and I can easily answer that in the chat area.
Okay. And then there's a question from Phil as well. Would you like to answer that in the chat as well?
Yes, let's do that, and then we can come back to it at the end if there's time.
Perfect. So Peter and Phil, if you have some follow-up questions or if your question wasn't answered fully, just let us know and we'll be sure you get that response. Did you want me to advance the slide, Jenny?
Yes, that'd be great. Thanks, Lori. And well, just to point out too, is we have focused a lot of our discussion on, principals, people in positions of authority. And the one thing I would also like to highlight is, when we're looking at the potential for perceived coercion, it's always top coming down. There's lots of opportunities for if students or teachers conducting interviews or focus groups with other teachers in the school is completely acceptable, depending on the topic and the situation, or attempting to collect data from their superiors. Again, we're really looking at that top-down level of that potential for perceived coercion. Again, and specific with teachers as well, other creative solutions, perhaps if they're a third grade teacher in the school, considering if they're wanting to collect data from students about their perceptions of a program or a school environment, considering to collect data from a fourth or fifth grade students that they have either already had in the past and really won't have again in the future. And the same applies to people in other positions of authority. Authority isn't limited to just teachers and administrators. Certainly our students hold lots of positions in schools. It's not uncommon for them to be very involved in, coaches, counselors, committee chairs, a student council representative, those types of positions. We just need to consider those and to put them into context. But another option is waiting to collect data until after the grades have been assigned for a specific term. If a researcher is really interested in what happened during a specific term, just waiting to collect that data until after the grades have been assigned. Really finding those creative timings for when the data can be collected, to essentially remove the elements that would create the situations for that potential for perceived coercion. And like we said, we recognize that it is that duality of what makes it difficult to conduct research in one's own educational setting is what also can make it so beneficial. And so there are lots, like we said, there's lots of opportunities and lots of creative solutions. And it's just helping students sometimes think of a bit more broadly and creatively to address their research depending on what they're considering. And some more practical tips as well. We kind of hit on this before, as far as making sure that the timing of the data collection, especially if it involves students, really minimizes any disruption during the day. But this can apply to if we have researchers that are wanting to collect data from their colleagues and whatnot, minimizing the disruption to their day as well, of being respectful that they may be interrupting what could be a work environment, and taking the necessary steps, and certainly using a faculty meeting or using other administrative meetings or parent teacher association sessions, to provide information about a study and even explain that a study is being done, hand out various materials about a study, are certainly great recruiting options. But care also needs to be taken to not require those attendees to make a decision on the spot, especially if an authority administrator would be at that session as well, because we certainly don't want to, potential participants to feel like they're being put on the spot to make a quick decision, and if their building principal is watching to see who says yes, certainly if people offer to participate, that's one thing, but requiring something at that time is something that should be avoided. And especially when dealing with studies that involve children in K-12 schools, really, I mean, it requires parental consent anyway. And so that is just another element of, talking in front of a class and explaining information about the study is certainly fine, using a few minutes of class, but also, ensuring that enough time is allowed to protect the privacy of those in attendance, and also for those that don't want to participate, to basically not highlight that they're not participating, and just respecting their decision and respecting their privacy in that regard. And we did discuss this earlier as well, relating to that justice principle, as far as, when it is ethically appropriate for a study to be done in a school. And because of the multitude of issues that students can face, and teachers, administrators, there really is a broad applicability with this. But it is just important, students, it has come up from time to time that students want to conduct study at a school simply because it provides a convenient population. And in all honesty, that is something that we will push back on just a bit, because it's not enough just for them to be there and to be an accessible population. There really does need to be a rationale to ensure that that principle of justice is met, because we don't want to use students or subordinates for certain situations just because they're there. But again, with a lot of our students, when they're in educational type programs, it is just a natural fit. And so again, just helping them understand and to provide that rationale as they're working through it, so that way they have provided that justification for what they're doing. We do also want to point out too, it's not uncommon for studies to come up where students want to focus on a specific subpopulation within a school. They might want to look at how something impacts a specific, maybe all the girls in the school, or a certain ethnicities, or whether students have a learning disorder. And while certainly that research is very important, that is also another situation where students really need to provide a very clear ethical rationale for excluding other groups. And this is really, there are many situations where that ethical justification can be made, but not always. Many education issues impact most students. And so that's just something we want our researchers to be aware of, to not exclude populations just because they personally want to focus on one. Their justification needs to be based on their research, which is founded in their literature. But as an additional point to go with that, even when it is ethically justifiable, it can be a pragmatic challenge to identify and invite individuals that qualify for a study based on certain identifiers, largely because what is in a student's record is protected by FERPA, which is the federal regulation that governs educational records. And basically any public or most private educational K-12, even universities, are regulated by FERPA. And so those student records, there is a limit on what a school can release without prior parental and or student consent. And so those are just, if a recruitment that focuses on a specific subpopulation, the recruitment would just need to be done in a discreet and respectful manner, so as to not involve potentially stigmatizing labels or stereotypes or experiences. And, this can range from, maybe sending home flyers and allowing people to self-select into a study, or sometimes, maybe having um, possibly moving the recruitment to outside of the school and then kind of bringing it back into the school a little bit later on. And certainly, so if you have students that are really wanting to focus on a small subpopulation, kind of like that, certainly it would encourage you to have them contact the IRB so that we can help them identify some potential options and possibilities of recruitment that would work based on what it is that they're looking to do, because there are a lot of issues that we just want to make sure that we're not that the student doesn't put themselves in a situation where they're asking the school to do something that they can't do. But I did also want to highlight, though, is that these FERPA regulations are specific to identifiable information that is in a student's record. So to kind of piggyback on that secondary analysis that Leilani mentioned earlier, schools certainly can release information in which identifying information has been removed. And so again, it's very, very possible for a secondary analysis of maybe student records, student data, student test scores to be done and not involve parental consent, because the school can easily remove any identifiable information. And so just kind of keeping that in mind, because it is very easy to create a data set that has multiple points and then just strip the data set of any identifiers once it's been created. And so that does present a very useful opportunity for students, especially when they're wanting to look at, maybe the effects or the impacts of certain things, so that way they can get that information and really not have to involve the students or the parents at all. And really would highlight too, it's never too early to begin communicating with the schools. They really would be in the best position to explain maybe how the study could practically be accomplished. They might have their own policies, things to consider, and communication doesn't end once approval has been obtained. We expect our researchers to go back to the schools to provide the results of the study, but really, we do often get asked, when can I get approval? And it really is just never too early to begin that conversation, because getting the support of the school, getting their input, conducting the study in a way that would be most beneficial to them will ultimately benefit the student as well, because it can only strengthen their study and help them understand the steps that they need to take to move this study forward. So do you want to advance to the next slide, Lori? So just a few takeaways. We've talked a little bit about this. We do have several documents, several essentially FAQ guides that are on our website, and so certainly would encourage your students to review our website, submit questions either to the IRB at irb@waldenu.edu directly, or attend the advising sessions that we have available now, because they really are great opportunities to brainstorm possible solutions. And also just encourage, again, the flexibility to help students understand that there might be another route to get to the research that they want to conduct. And if you want to go to the last slide, Lori, just wanted to highlight some of the IRB resources that we have available. Again, these documents are on our website, and certainly the early planning is the best thing that we can do to help our students.
Thanks so much, Jenny. And we're closing in at the top of the hour, and I see Leilani is still having some great conversations, answering your specific questions in the chat box. So we'll just give a few minutes for that to finish up. Know that if there are additional questions, I'll be sending up a follow-up email with both Leilani and Jenny's email addresses, so you can catch them if you have some additional questions. The best place to get your general IRB questions answered is that last email there, irb@waldenu.edu. That's the general IRB roll account, and the folks there, Jenny and Leilani, are very quick and very detailed in answering your questions. So that's a great place to get those answered. With that, any final words, Jenny, Leilani?
Yes,
No, thank you again to everyone who's attending.
Thank you so much. And as you mentioned, as Lori mentioned, you're welcome to reach out to us personally, but you will always get a faster response if you email irb@waldenu.edu and if you send students to that address, because then that's how we are able to direct the students to either the office hours or to get an appointment set up with one of us. So if one of us is out, you could be waiting weeks for a response. So please use the irb@waldenu.edu email address. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. And thanks so much to all of you for spending a bit of your afternoon with us. Overall, I think my first use of Adobe went well, so thanks all of you for your patience and for working with me on this today. I think this was a really great webinar, and so you should get an email from me in the next day or so with the recording, the IRB email address. I'm going to send out that link to the IRB office hours and a copy of this presentation, so you can all have that at your disposal. So with that, I'd like to say, again, thank you. Goodbye. Have a great rest of your day.